Commander Brett Harlow had seen men die in every way the mountains of eastern Afghanistan could invent. He had watched good soldiers disappear into valleys that had no names on any map. He had written letters to wives and mothers and fathers who would never fully understand what had happened to the men they loved. He had stood at the edge of forward operating bases in the pre-dawn dark and stared at ridgelines that stared back at him with perfect indifference. But 3 deaths in 12 seconds was something new. 3 of his best scouts, 3 men who had survived 2 deployments each. 3 men who knew these mountains the way other men knew their own backyards, where the shadows fell wrong, where the wind changed character, where the ground told stories to those patient enough to read them. 3 men who should have been impossible to kill. The mountains of Kunar province rose in layers above Fob Sentinel, each ridge darker than the one before it, each peak dissolving into a sky so blue it seemed artificial. It was beautiful country. Harlow had stopped trusting beautiful country a long time ago. He ran 2 fingers along the scar that curved from his right temple down toward his jaw. Fallujah, 2004. A memory his body carried so he wouldn't have to think about it consciously. The ridge of scar tissue had become a habit, something his hand found whenever his mind encountered a problem it couldn't immediately solve. 3 men, 12 seconds. A 3-inch grouping at a distance his best analysts were calling somewhere between 1,200 and 1,400 meters. He turned away from the mountains and walked back toward the armory. The armory at FOB Sentinel smelled the way all military armories smelled, of solvent and metal and the discipline that kept dangerous things in their proper place. It was mid-afternoon, and the building hummed with the routine sounds of men preparing for missions that hadn't been named yet. Harlow moved through the space with the easy authority of a man who had commanded these rooms his entire adult life. Soldiers nodded as he passed. He acknowledged them with the minimal gestures of a commander who respected his men's focus. He was nearly to the rear exit when something made him stop. A figure sat alone at a workbench in the far corner. The bench was covered in components. A Barrett M82A1 broken down into its constituent pieces, each one arranged with a precision that went beyond habit into something closer to ritual. The person working was slight, dark-haired, and completely absorbed in the task. Harlow watched. The hands moving over the firing pin assembly were not following standard military procedure. They were faster, more certain. The kind of movement that comes not from memorizing a manual, but from having performed an operation so many times that the hands remember what the mind has long since stopped supervising. She was making adjustments to the scope mount with tools Harlow didn't recognize, in a way that suggested she wasn't servicing the weapon so much as having a private conversation with it. He moved closer. Staff sergeant, female, dark hair pulled back in a tight regulation bun, sharp jaw, eyes entirely focused on the barrel she was now examining with a borescope, tilting it toward the fluorescent light with the careful attention of a surgeon reading tissue. She stopped. Her hands went still. Without turning, she spoke. "Commander Harlow." Her voice was level and professional, carrying no surprise at being observed. "Staff Sergeant Claire Voss, JSOC sent me this morning. I was told to report directly to you after getting my equipment in order." Harlow hadn't been notified. That wasn't entirely unusual. Joint Special Operations Command moved specialists like chess pieces, sometimes faster than the paperwork. But he studied her for a long moment before he spoke. "What are you doing with that Barrett, Sergeant?" She set down the borescope and looked at him for the first time. Her eyes were gray. They assessed him with the direct steadiness of someone who had learned long ago that looking away from authority cost more than it saved. "You have a long-range problem, sir." She gestured at the weapon. "I'm your long-range solution." The briefing room held 8 people when Harlow convened the meeting an hour later. Lieutenant Meredith Sloan stood near the wall-mounted display, pulling up satellite imagery with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this conversation since before Harlow had asked for it. The rest were senior operators, Men who had earned their places in this room through years of work that most people would never know about. They looked at Voss the way men in that community always looked at a newcomer, measuring, withholding, waiting to be shown something before deciding what to believe. Sloan brought up the forensic data from the 3 kills. The imagery was clinical in the way that battlefield forensics always was, precise without being gentle. 3 positions, 3 entry wounds, 1 shooter. The grouping overlaid on a standard grid made the distance viscerally clear even before the numbers appeared on screen. Based on trajectory reconstruction and terminal ballistics, Sloan said, we're estimating the shots originated from between 1,200 and 1,400 meters, all 3 within a 3-inch radius. Time between first and third impact, 11.4 seconds. The room was quiet. One of the senior operators, a man named Briggs, whose face had been rearranged by shrapnel somewhere in Iraq, leaned back in his chair. Taliban don't shoot like that. No, Harlow said, they don't. He let that sit for a moment before nodding to Sloan. The next image on the screen was a dossier. Russian. Older photograph, but the face was recognizable. Silver hair, deep-set eyes, a scar that ran from the right temple toward the jaw. Anton Drekhov, Sloan said, former Spetsnaz, 67 years old. For the last decade and a half, he's been running a specialized training program the intelligence community calls Phantom. The program selects candidates for long-range precision work, but it doesn't train them in controlled environments. She advanced the slide. Phantom uses live operational theaters, real targets. The qualification standard requires confirmed kills at extreme range against actual military personnel. She paused. The 3 scouts we lost 3 days ago were not victims of an ambush. They were examination questions. Briggs sat forward. You're telling me our men died so some Russian could get a passing grade? That's exactly what I'm telling you. The room absorbed this in the way that experienced soldiers absorb information that reorders their understanding. Not with visible shock, but with a settling stillness, the way a building shifts almost imperceptibly when the ground beneath it moves. Voss had said nothing during the briefing. Harlow had watched her. She looked at the imagery with the focused attention of someone confirming things she already suspected rather than learning things for the first time. On the way out, one of the operators said it quietly, just loud enough to carry. A female, long-range specialist. This should be interesting. Harlow made a note of who had said it. He didn't turn around. That evening, he found Voss still in the armory. The Barrett was reassembled, resting on its mount. She was working on something smaller, a custom loading press, hand-measuring powder charges with a precision scale that looked like it belonged in a laboratory rather than a forward operating base. He watched her pick up a finished cartridge. She held it at eye level, examined it, then she raised it to her nose. She set it down and made a small notation in a weatherproof notebook. Sergeant, sir, that round looks standard to me. She didn't look up. Humidity has been rising since 0600, sir. Factory loads for this caliber are balanced for sea level standard conditions. At current humidity and our elevation, this specific load will run approximately 2 inches low at 800 meters. The deviation compounds past 1200. She set the notebook down and picked up another cartridge. These are corrected. Harlow pulled out the small atmospheric gauge he carried in his left breast pocket. He had checked it that morning. He checked it now. He looked at the number for a long moment. She was right, to the degree she had described, without instruments. He put the gauge away without commenting on it, but he stood there a moment longer than he had intended to, watching her work, before he turned and left. Master Sergeant Owen Decker arrived the following morning on the early resupply flight from Bagram. Harlow had requested him specifically, though requesting Decker was somewhat like requesting the weather. You could ask for it, and it would come on its own schedule regardless. The man was 63 years old and moved with the economy of someone who had spent 4 decades learning that wasted motion was a form of risk. His hair had gone completely white. His skin was the color of old leather left in the sun. But it was his eyes that people noticed. Sharp, impatient, and missing nothing. The eyes of a man who had been watching things carefully for so long that it had become structural, built into the way he occupied space. Gulf War, 1991. Somalia, 1993. A list of subsequent deployments that existed primarily in classified files. A reputation that lived primarily in the memories of men who had served alongside him and considered themselves fortunate for it. Harlow met him at the landing pad. "You have a long-range problem," Decker said, squinting at the ridgelines before he had fully descended from the aircraft. "Not a question." "We have several. Come meet the solution JSOC sent us." The Tactical Operations Center was quiet when they arrived. Boss was at the map display, studying satellite imagery of the Eastern Valley systems with the fixed attention of someone memorizing a landscape rather than merely observing it. She had marked positions on the map in red, firing locations, escape routes, terrain features that would matter to someone planning an operation in that ground. When she looked up and saw Decker, something in her posture changed. Not much, but Harlow caught it. A subtle shift, something between recognition and the careful management of a feeling she had no intention of displaying. "Master Sergeant Decker," she straightened. Decker looked at the map. He looked at the positions she had marked. Then he looked at her with the unhurried assessment of a man who has seen a great many things and knows which ones matter. "Still favoring the Barrett, I see." "Best tool for the problem, Master Sergeant." He picked up one of her custom cartridges from the tray beside the map table, turned it slowly between his fingers. "You've modified the projectile geometry." It wasn't a question. Reduced drag at supersonic transition makes a measurable difference past 2,000 meters. Decker set the cartridge down carefully. He turned to the display. "Where's the most likely position, based on your trajectory reconstruction?" Harlow nodded to Sloan, who brought up the overlay. Decker studied it. He shook his head slowly. "Too exposed," he said. "A shooter with this level of discipline wouldn't use that face." "It's not exposed if you approach from the northeastern slope," Voss said. "There's a natural depression about 60 meters below the crest, concealed from aerial surveillance if you move in the pre-dawn window and use the rock formation as a thermal break." Decker looked at her, looked at the map, looked at her again with an expression that was something more than professional approval. "Good catch," he said. And the way he said it, quiet, certain, told Harlow that this was not a man complimenting a stranger. That night, long after the base had settled into its operational rhythms, Harlow walked the perimeter and thought about the two of them. The old man and the young woman. The way Decker had watched her work. The way she had not asked for his approval and had not appeared to need it, yet the two of them had moved around each other in the Tactical Operations Center with the unconscious coordination of people who had been, at some point, in each other's orbit long enough for it to become instinctive. He had requested Decker for his experience with Russian doctrine and long-range interdiction theory. He was beginning to understand that Decker had come for a different reason entirely. The intelligence package from Sloan's overnight analysis arrived at 0430. Among the materials recovered from a cache, the reconnaissance team had located 2 kilometers northeast of the 3 scouts' last known position. Encrypted communication equipment and a printed schedule written in Cyrillic was a single line that Sloan had highlighted and translated twice to make sure she had it right. Final qualification event. Eastern approach. Personal supervision by primary instructor. Harlow read it standing up, still in his jacket from the night before. He found Decker in the mess hall at 0500, drinking coffee and looking at nothing in particular with the focused attention of a man whose mind was working even when his body appeared to be resting. Harlow slid the document across the table without speaking. Decker read it once, set it down, picked up his coffee. "Dreykov's coming himself," Decker said. The words were quiet, measured. But something moved beneath them. Something old and complicated that Harlow couldn't fully read. In 22 years, I have never known Anton Dreykov to supervise a final qualification event in person. Why would he change his pattern now? Decker was quiet for a long moment. He looked out the window at the mountains, where the first gray light was just beginning to define the ridgelines against the sky. Because something specific brought him here, he said, something he couldn't send a subordinate to assess. He looked at Harlow steadily. Or someone. He said it without elaboration, not like a theory but like a conclusion he had been carrying for some time and had just now decided to set on the table. It told Harlow that the conversation was not finished and that the rest of it would need to wait for a moment he couldn't yet see. Outside, the mountains held their silence. Inside, in the armory, Claire Voss was already working. She had been working since before the base woke up. She had been working the way people work when they know something is coming and they intend to be ready for it. Not from fear, but from the deep and quiet discipline of someone who has spent her entire adult life preparing for a moment she could not yet fully name. The Barrett rested on its mount. The custom cartridges waited in their tray. And somewhere in the dark folds of the Kunar ridgeline, approximately 1,400 meters from where Harlow stood with his cooling coffee, whatever was coming was already beginning to move. The armory at 2 in the morning belonged to a different kind of soldier. Not the soldiers who trained in daylight and debriefed over hot food and slept in rotations designed to keep human beings functional. The armory at 2 in the morning belonged to the ones who could not afford to stop. The ones for whom preparation was not a stage before the mission, but the mission itself, ongoing and without natural end. Claire Voss had been at the workbench for 6 hours. The Barrett's barrel was off the receiver, resting in a padded cradle she had constructed from folded equipment bags. Beside it, in precise arrangement, lay components that had no counterpart in any standard military inventory. A trigger group modified at the sear interface with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. A recoil buffer assembly rebuilt around a principle she had worked out over 2 years of calculation and field testing. A scope mount with vibration dampening characteristics that most weapons engineers would have called unnecessary, and that Voss knew was the difference between a hit and a miss at ranges where every variable compounded against you. The custom cartridges were finished. 40 of them, each one hand-loaded to specifications she had refined over hundreds of hours at high-altitude ranges, where thin air made the standard calculations unreliable. Each propellant charge measured to within a tenth of a grain. Each projectile seated to a depth that accounted for the specific harmonic signature of this particular barrel, which she had mapped over 300 rounds until she understood it the way a musician understands an instrument. Not as a tool, but as a system with its own character, its own tendencies, its own way of behaving under stress. She picked up the last cartridge, held it at eye level, then raised it to her nose. Set it down, made a notation. She heard the door. She did not turn around. She already knew the weight of Owen Decker's footstep, the slight emphasis on the left foot, the deliberate pace of a man who had long ago made peace with the fact that hurrying rarely improved outcomes. He set something on the bench beside her without speaking. She looked at it. A leather case, old and worn at the corners, with the patina of something that had been carried in field conditions for decades. She unclipped the latches and opened it. Inside, resting in custom foam cutouts, was a ballistic calculator unlike anything she had seen in official channels. The housing was old, late 1980s construction by the look of it, but the interface panel had been updated, newer components integrated into the original architecture with the careful hand of someone who understood that the core design was worth preserving. Built by a civilian engineer who worked for NASA and competed in long-range shooting on weekends, Decker said, sitting down on the bench across from her. He made 3 of them. 2 are in a museum somewhere. He gave me this one in 1994 and told me to use it when the standard tools ran out of answers. Voss turned it in her hands, examining the input parameters. The specialized variables were immediately evident, things that commercial and military ballistic calculators simply did not account for. Coriolis compensation built into the primary calculation rather than applied as a secondary correction. Barometric pressure gradient variation across the bullet's flight path, not just at the firing position. Atmospheric refraction modeling for extreme range. It accounts for pressure differential by altitude segment, she said. Not a single point measurement. That's the one that makes the difference past 3,000 meters. Most systems assume constant pressure across the flight path. In mountain terrain, the variation can shift your point of impact by enough to matter. Voss set the calculator down and returned to the barrel. For a while, neither of them spoke. The armory held the silence of a place where serious people were doing serious work. A silence that was full rather than empty. "You don't need it," Decker said. His voice was quiet, observational rather than challenging. Voss's hands did not stop moving. "You use the calculator to document the solution," he continued, "to create a record of the steps, but you already know the answer before you run the numbers." He paused. "Your father worked the same way. He told me once that the mathematics was a translation, that he arrived at the answer through a process he didn't fully understand, and then worked backward to express it in language other people could verify." Voss set down the tool she was holding. She did not turn around. "Not now, Master Sergeant." Decker accepted this with the patience of a man who had learned when to press and when to wait. He looked at the cartridges in their tray, at the modified components on the bench, at the woman who had made all of them, who had been awake longer than was reasonable and was still working with the focused precision of someone for whom precision was not a professional standard, but a personal code. "The briefing is at 0700, he said. "You should eat something before then." "I'll eat after." He stood, moved toward the door, stopped. "Claire." She turned. He had almost never used her first name. In the years she had known him, the training, the classified operations that existed in no record she could access, the long gaps during which she had sometimes wondered whether he was still alive, he had called her Sergeant, or Voss, or occasionally nothing at all, addressing her through the mission rather than through her name. "Your father would have recognized this moment," he said. "He anticipated it. That matters. I want you to know it matters." He left before she could respond. She stood at the workbench for a long time after the door closed. Then she picked up the tool she had set down and went back to work. The mission briefing convened in the command center at 0700, with a weight in the air that everyone present recognized and no one named. Commander Harlow stood at the display with the stillness of a man who had made a decision and was now explaining it rather than reconsidering it. Sloan had the satellite imagery prepared. Decker sat against the wall in the manner of an observer whose attention was precise and directional, even when it appeared relaxed. Voss sat at the table with her notebook open and her expression neutral. Harlow brought up the topographical display. The Eastern Ridge System appeared in three-dimensional relief, a complex anatomy of rock and shadow that the mountains had spent millennia constructing. He indicated a position on the far ridge. Then he indicated a second position, farther and higher, separated from the first by a valley that the scale of the display made look manageable, and that Harlow knew from experience was neither. Dreykov's most likely observation position, based on Sergeant Voss's terrain analysis and Master Sergeant Decker's assessment of Dreykov's documented tactical preferences, is here. He indicated the far point. The distance from our proposed counter-sniper position to that location is 3,247 meters. The room took a moment with this number. Briggs looked at the display, looked at Harlow. "That's not an engagement distance. That's a geography lesson. It is also the only position from which we can cover the likely enemy location while remaining outside the effective observation range of Dreykov's advance elements." Harlow looked at Voss. "Sergeant," the question on everyone's mind. She had heard the question before. She would hear it again. She answered it the same way she always answered it, not with reassurance or performance, but with the flat accuracy of a professional stating operational parameters. Yes, sir. It's possible. Not guaranteed. The variables at that range interact in ways that create uncertainty, even with optimal preparation. But possible, yes. The plan was precise in the way that all good military plans were precise. Not because precision was achievable under combat conditions, but because precision established a baseline that gave everyone a reference point when things inevitably departed from it. A decoy convoy of unmanned vehicles would move along the eastern approach road at 0900, matching the timing in Dreykov's recovered schedule. Voss and Decker would be in position before first light. A quick reaction force would hold 2 kilometers back. After the briefing emptied the room, Colonel Marsh appeared on the secure line from Bagram. Harlow took the call in his office, alone. He listened for 4 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "Understood, sir," and ended the call. He sat at his desk for a moment before going to find Voss. He found her in the corridor, studying a printed meteorological report that Sloan had prepared. High-resolution pressure and wind maps for the target area covering the next 48 hours. Sloan's brother worked in atmospheric sciences and had helped extract the data without knowing why it was needed. "I need a private word, Sergeant." They stepped into the supply room off the main corridor. Harlow closed the door. "Dreykov knows about you." He said it simply, without building toward it. "That's the intelligence Marsh just passed. It's not new. It's been assessed and reassessed for months, and the conclusion keeps coming back the same way." He watched her face. "He didn't come to Afghanistan to run a qualification exercise. That's incidental. He came because his network identified you as an asset of interest, and he wanted to assess the situation personally." Voss said nothing. "Your father's research," Harlow continued, "whatever he was working on, the program, the theoretical framework, Dreykov has been aware of it for years, and he has been aware of you as a potential subject of that research for longer than either of us would find comfortable." He paused. "You are not just our asset in this operation, Sergeant. You are also the reason the target is here at all." Voss looked at the meteorological report in her hands, at the wind charts, at the pressure gradient lines that curved over the mountain terrain like a second geography overlaid on the visible one. "I know," she said. Harlow waited. "I've known since the first briefing, sir. The pattern of the qualification shots, the positions, the timing, the deliberate exposure of the method. It was designed to be read. It was a message." She looked up. "He was telling us what he had. He was asking us to send our best. And we sent you." "Yes, sir." Harlow studied her for a long moment. "Does that change your approach to the mission?" "It clarifies it," she said. They left the wire at 2,200, moving through darkness with the discipline that turns 2 people into an absence. Something the landscape doesn't register, something the eye slides past without finding purchase. Voss carried the Barrett in its transport configuration, broken down across a custom frame that distributed the weight without compromising her movement. Decker carried the spotting equipment, the ballistic calculator, and on his back in a padded case he had never once set down carelessly, a meteorological monitoring array that could track wind, temperature, pressure, and humidity at the firing position, and interpolate conditions at the target area based on terrain modeling. They moved for 3 hours without speaking, communicating through hand signals and the shared understanding of 2 operators who had rehearsed this kind of movement enough times that coordination had become automatic. The ground was difficult in the way this part of Afghanistan was always difficult. Not the dramatic difficulty of sheer faces, but the grinding difficulty of terrain that had no flat surfaces and no predictable angles, that demanded continuous micro-adjustment from every muscle, that punished inattention with twisted ankles and overconfidence with falls. They reached the position at 0110, a natural depression in the ridgeline, sheltered by rock on 3 sides, with a clear sight line to the northeast that opened across the valley to the far ridge, like a corridor built for exactly this purpose. Voss assembled the firing platform first, working by feel in near total darkness, her hands knowing the components without requiring her eyes. The Barrett came together in silence, each piece finding its place with the soft precision of a thing designed to fit. The scope mount went on last. She checked the torque on each fastener with a tool calibrated to her specifications. Decker set up the spotting position 3 feet to her left and 18 inches back. The meteorological array went up last, its sensors oriented to capture wind data from the dominant approach direction. By 0200, the position was established. The valley below was dark and still. Somewhere beyond the far ridge, approximately 3,000 meters of air and elevation away, Anton Drekhov's advance team was sleeping. Decker began the night watch. Voss sat in her firing position and did not sleep. The wind came in from the northwest at irregular intervals. 3 knots, then 7, then barely anything, then 3 again. She felt it on her face, in the backs of her hands, and through the fabric of her jacket where it touched her collarbone. She was not measuring it. She was listening to it the way you listen to a voice telling you something important in a language you learned before you learned to speak. An hour before dawn, Decker spoke. "Somalia," he said. His voice carried the particular quiet of a man saying something he has decided to say and has no intention of taking back. 1993. "I need you to understand something about your father before tomorrow." He paused, choosing the sequence carefully. "He wasn't gone when you were 12 in the way you may have believed. He went into deep cover in 1989, the year he told your mother he was leaving. Not dead, gone, into work that couldn't accommodate a family without putting that family at risk. He operated in classified channels for 14 years. Somalia was 4 years into that separation. The last deployment in 2003 was the one he didn't come back from." Voss said nothing. Her eyes were open and fixed on a point in the darkness ahead. "In Somalia," Decker continued, "your father's team was supporting a direct action mission that went wrong in the 3rd hour. 3 vehicles down, enemy on 3 sides. No air support because the weather had closed the corridors. 22 of us. We were going to lose most of them." He adjusted his night vision device. "The shooting started from a position nobody had cleared. Single rifle. 1 shot at a time. 7 shots over 11 minutes. Each one a leadership target. The people coordinating the encirclement. After the 7th shot, the tactical situation collapsed and we extracted." He was quiet for a moment. "We never identified the shooter officially. No American unit claimed the operation. No record of supporting fire. But your father was in country that week. And when I saw him 3 days later, he was cleaning a rifle that had been fired recently, and he looked at me with the face of a man carrying something he was not going to set down." The darkness held everything in place. "He made it out of Somalia," Voss said. Not quite a question, not quite a statement. A small opening she was creating deliberately to see what would come through it. "He made it out of Somalia," Decker said. And then, very quietly, "He didn't make it out of 2003. The locker at Bagram, he left it with me before that last deployment. He knew the odds." Voss let the silence stand. She had lived with the shape of the thing for long enough that she no longer needed to press at its edges. She had the outline, the rest was in the locker. 30 minutes before dawn, the wind shifted. It moved before the instruments caught it, before the trees in the valley below showed any visible response. Voss felt it, a subtle alteration in the air's texture, the way a room changes when a door opens somewhere distant. She turned her face into it, reading direction and quality and the particular signature of a pressure front moving through the upper valley. She reached for the scope and made 3 adjustments. Then she settled back into her firing position without looking at the instruments. Decker watched her. Then he checked the meteorological display. He looked at the adjustments she had made. He did the calculation in his head. She had compensated precisely for a wind shift that the instruments had not yet registered. He said nothing. He looked back at the far ridge and waited for the light to come. Dreykov arrived at 0638, 5 figures moving along the northeastern face of the ridge in a tactical pattern that was, even at this distance, immediately distinguishable from irregular fighters. The spacing, the use of terrain for concealment, the specific way each person moved in relation to the others, contributing to a collective awareness greater than the sum of its parts. The lead figure moved differently from the others, not faster or slower, but with a quality of attention that changed the way the whole group oriented. The others were watching the terrain. The lead figure was watching everything: terrain, sky, the distant valley, the angles of approach from every direction. His head moved in small, continuous adjustments that spoke of a lifetime of understanding that the world was always about to produce something unexpected and that the only reasonable response was to never fully stop expecting it. Movement, Decker said. 5 individuals, northeast face. Lead figure matches Dreykov's physical profile. Height, build, movement characteristics, age appropriate. Voss had already found them. Through the optics, she could see the silver hair, short and military even in the field. The deliberate economy of the lead figure's movements, the way the others positioned themselves around him, not as protection exactly, but as an arrangement that kept him centered and informed. The way soldiers orient around a commander not because they are guarding him, but because they are extending his awareness. She watched him turn to one of the others and point. She understood the gesture across 3,000 meters of air. He was indicating a firing position, explaining why this one and not the one 20 meters to the left. Teaching. Facial confirmation, Decker said. Silver hair, beard, scar running from right temple toward the jaw. One beat of silence. That's Dreykov. Voss had already settled into her natural point of aim. The communication with base was brief. Harlow's voice on the encrypted radio, clear and controlled. Authorization granted. Protect the mission. Protect our people. Decker gave her the final environmental data. Range confirmed, 3,247 meters. Wind at our position, 4 knots northwest. Estimated wind at target, 9 knots, quartering from the northeast. Temperature, 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Barometric pressure dropping ahead of the front. Voss made the final scope adjustments. The calculations ran in the part of her mind that had always done this work. Not sequentially, not the way a calculator processes steps, but simultaneously, the way a musician hears harmony. All the variables present at once, resolved into a single answer. Coriolis effect, 37 centimeters right at this range and bearing. Bullet drop, approximately 27 meters, compensated in the elevation setting. Flight time, 6 seconds at this muzzle velocity and atmospheric density. Barometric gradient variation across 4 altitude segments. Accounted for. She found her natural point of aim. Settled. Let the last of her conscious attention release from everything except the alignment of the crosshairs and the stillness at the center of her breathing. Dreykov was kneeling beside a trainee, his hand on the younger man's shoulder, his face turned toward the valley below, where the decoy convoy was just becoming visible on the approach road. The wind shifted again, sharper than the pre-dawn change, driven by the pressure front moving through the upper valley. This time, she did not need to adjust. The firing solution she had built over the last 4 hours had included this moment. She had felt it coming since 0430 and had already written it into the answer. She held. Wind settling, Decker said, watching the display catch up to what she already knew. Steady window opening. I have it, she said. 2 seconds. Send it, Decker said. Claire Voss completed the trigger pull with the absolute stillness of someone for whom this moment was not an ending, but a resolution. The answer to a question that had been building since she was 12 years old, and the world had rearranged itself around an absence she hadn't been given the full truth about until an hour ago. The Barrett fired. The recoil moved through her in a straight line, absorbed and controlled, and she held her position through it, the crosshairs staying with the target across the valley. 6 seconds. The longest 6 seconds of the mission. The 6 seconds in which everything either was or wasn't. Dreykov dropped. "Impact," Decker said. "Center mass. Target down." He watched through the spotting scope for 3 full seconds. No movement. Dreykov is neutralized. On the far ridge, the training session became something else entirely. The extraction began before the enemy recovered. They had perhaps 4 minutes before Dreykov's team, trained specifically to respond to exactly this type of event, would begin systematic counter-sniper protocols. Voss had the Barrett broken down and loaded in 90 seconds. Decker had the spotting equipment collapsed and packed in the same window. They moved. They had covered 800 meters toward the extraction point when the first shot hit. It struck the rock face 2 feet to Voss's right with the sharp crack of a precision round. The sound told her everything she needed: the angle of impact, the timing between the report and the strike, the distance and direction of the origin. One of Dreykov's trainees. 800 meters, Eastern Ridge. Well-trained, calm under circumstances designed to produce either panic or excellence. She and Decker went to cover without speaking. The extraction helicopter was audible now, rotors cutting the cold air from the southwest, the sound growing as it descended toward the designated landing zone 300 meters ahead. Decker assessed the shooter's position. Single shooter, Eastern Ridge, 800 meters, south face concealment. His M110 was already unslung. He began moving toward a counter position, a cluster of boulders that would give him a firing line on the Eastern Ridge with adequate cover. "I'll delay them," he said. "Get to the helicopter. One of us needs to reach extraction with confirmation of the mission." Negative. Voss kept her eyes on the Eastern Ridge, reading the intervals between shots, mapping the pattern. "We extract together." "That's not a discussion, Sergeant. Protocol is clear." "We extract together, Master Sergeant." Another round struck, closer. The shooter was walking the impacts toward their position, using each strike as a ranging correction. Decker looked at her, then at the helicopter settling onto the landing zone ahead. 10 minutes, he said. "Then we both move." He went to his counter position. What followed arrived in memory afterward, not as a sequence, but as a collection of images without clear order. Decker at his position, engaging the Eastern Ridge with the measured patience of a man who had been doing this for 40 years. Voss moving toward the helicopter by a route that kept rock between her and the shooter's adjustment angles. The crew chief in the door of the aircraft gesturing with the urgency of a man who understood that every second on the ground was a second too long. She reached the helicopter, turned to provide cover, looked back. Decker was moving, not the running of a man in his prime, but the running of a man who had decided that a damaged leg was a problem for later and a living enemy was a problem for now. 60 meters out, then 50. The round caught him at 40 meters. It took him through the upper thigh and dropped him hard onto the rocky ground, and he came down with the graceless weight of a man whose body had simply stopped cooperating with his intentions. Voss was out of the helicopter before she had consciously decided to leave it. The crew chief shouted something. The door gunner began laying suppressive fire across the Eastern Ridge. She was already at a sprint, moving across open ground with the Barrett slung across her back, and nothing in her hands except the certainty that there was one acceptable outcome here, and she intended to produce it. She reached Decker. He was already trying to get up, his jaw set against the pain in the way of men who have been hurt badly enough before that they know what it is and how long they can push through it. "I gave you an order, Sergeant." His voice was tight with the effort of staying functional. "I never was good at following orders." She got an arm under his shoulder and took his weight. "I learned that from my first instructor." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. They moved toward the aircraft, Voss taking most of his weight, her boots finding purchase on the uneven ground with the automatic precision of a body that had long since stopped asking permission from the terrain it crossed. The crew chief and another operator came out to meet them at 10 meters, and together they got Decker aboard with the organized urgency of people who understood that the aircraft's ground time had already exceeded what was safe. Voss was last. She turned at the door and put 3 rounds toward the eastern ridge. Not aimed fire, suppressive, buying the aircraft the seconds it needed to climb. And then she was inside and the helicopter was moving, pulling up and away with the purposeful angle of a machine that needed to be somewhere else. The mountains fell away beneath them. Decker was on his back on the cargo floor, one of the crew working on his leg with practiced efficiency. His color was poor, but his eyes were open, and they found Voss with the precision of a man whose faculties were still fully functional, even if his body was temporarily disagreeing with him. "Somalia," he said, his voice quieter now, the effort of it showing. "Your father pulled the same move. Came back for me when every protocol said, 'Leave me.'" He paused for breath. I told him he was an idiot. Voss kept pressure on the wound above where the crew member was working. "What did he say?" Decker closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "He said some things were worth being an idiot for." Outside the window, the Kunar ridgeline moved past and was gone, replaced by the longer geometries of the valley systems to the west. The radio crackled. Sloan's voice from FOB Sentinel, steady and precise. "Overwatch, this is Sentinel. Drone coverage confirms target is down. No movement at Dreykov's last position. Mission confirmed successful." A pause. "Welcome back." Voss looked at Decker. At the pallor of his face against the cargo floor. At the hands of the crew member working efficiently on the wound. Outside the window, the mountains held their silence, indifferent to everything that had just happened in the cold air above the valley floor. Indifferent to history and record and the weight of a mission that had just changed what was possible and would never appear in any document that anyone without the highest clearances could read. 6 seconds. The answer to a question that had been 20 years in the making. FOB. Sentinel looked different from the air on the return flight. Voss had flown into dozens of forward operating bases over the course of her career, and they all shared a quality that was difficult to name precisely, a compressed functionality, everything present that needed to be present and nothing else, the aesthetic of a place that had given up on appearances in service of survival. But FOB Sentinel, coming in from the northeast with the morning sun cutting hard shadows across the compound walls, looked smaller than it had when she had left it the night before. The mountains around it looked larger. That was how it always worked after a mission of this kind. The scale of everything adjusted. The world reorganized itself around what had just happened. She watched Decker being transferred to a stretcher on the landing pad, 2 medical personnel moving with practiced efficiency, and she tracked the pale determination of his face as he managed the pain with the quiet discipline of a man who had been managing pain for 40 years and considered it a private matter between himself and his body. Commander Harlow was waiting at the edge of the pad. He looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. She had senior officers did not fly to forward operating bases for routine operational debriefs. They sent representatives. They received written reports. Marsh coming himself meant that what had happened this morning had been felt at a level above the immediate chain of command, and that the people at that level had decided that certain aspects required direct management. She had expected this. She had expected it since the moment Decker had told her that Dreykov had come to Afghanistan specifically because of her. "I'd like to check on Master Sergeant Decker first, sir, before the medevac." "Of course. Medical is stabilizing him now. You have time." She turned toward the medical facility. Behind her, she heard Harlow say her name. She turned back. He looked at her with the careful directness of a man choosing his words with more precision than usual. "What you did out there this morning, what both of you did, I want you to know that I understand the weight of it, regardless of what the record says." "Thank you, sir." She left him standing on the landing pad and walked toward the medical facility, and she did not look back at the mountains, though she felt them behind her the entire way. She heard Decker before she reached the door. It is a through and through wound in the upper thigh. I have had more serious injuries from training accidents. I am entirely capable of completing a debrief before any evacuation is considered. The doctor's voice was measured in the way of someone practicing patience professionally. Master Sergeant, the imaging shows significant muscle trauma, and we need to rule out. The imaging shows a projectile that entered and exited without encountering anything that cannot be repaired with standard surgical intervention at a facility that has the appropriate equipment, which this is not. Therefore, I need to complete my debrief, and then I will submit to evacuation without further objection. Voss pushed the door open. Decker was on the examination table, his right leg elevated and heavily bandaged, an IV line in his left forearm, and an expression on his face that was precisely the expression of a man who considers medical personnel to be, on balance, both necessary and intrusive. He saw her. Some of the tension in his jaw released. Voss, tell this physician that I am cognitively functional and operationally capable of completing required post-mission documentation. You've been shot, Master Sergeant. I am aware of that. I was present when it happened. Voss looked at the doctor, who communicated a great deal with a single expression. Then she looked at Decker. The debrief can wait for Bagram, she said. I'll handle the initial report here. You'll have complete records before the formal review. Decker studied her. He understood, as he always understood the things she said, that operated on more than one level. That she was not simply talking about paperwork. There are things in that report that require careful framing, he said. I know how to frame them. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he settled back against the examination table with the resigned acceptance of a man who has decided that fighting on two fronts simultaneously is poor resource management. The doctor returned to the examination without further discussion. Voss moved to the chair beside the table. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the medical sounds of the room moved around them without touching the specific quality of the silence between them. He's sending you to Kazakhstan, Decker said. His voice was lower now, the performance of resistance gone from it. Marsh. He'll present it as a logical operational extension. You have first-hand exposure to Dreykov's methodology and equipment. You're uniquely positioned to assess the Kazakhstan facility. He looked at the ceiling. All of that is true. It's also a reason he had in mind before this morning. You knew about Kazakhstan before we deployed here. I knew it was a possibility that depended on outcomes. Voss absorbed this without visible reaction. She had long since learned that the architecture of operations like these was built in advance, with contingencies that the people executing the primary mission were not always shown. It was not a failure of trust. It was the operational reality of a world where information compartmentalization kept assets alive. Owen. He turned his head. She had almost never used his first name. The effect was visible even through the pain. The locker at Bagram, she said. How long has it been there? He was quiet for a long moment. Since 2003, he said, before his last deployment. He asked me to hold it until you reached a point in your career where it would mean something, rather than simply land on you before you had the context to carry it. And you decided this morning was that point? I decided this morning was that point. She nodded once. She stood. I'll see you at Bagram, she said. Voss. His voice stopped her at the door. She turned. He was proud of you, Decker said. Not of what you could do, of who you chose to be with it. There's a difference, and he understood that difference, and he wanted you to know that the second thing was the thing that mattered to him. She stood at the door for a moment without speaking. Then she left. The formal debrief convened in the command center's secure room at 1400 hours. Colonel Edward Marsh had arrived at 12:30. His manner of arrival, the direct transfer from the flight to the command center, without the usual social navigation of a senior officer visiting a subordinate installation, told Harlow, and through Harlow, everyone else, that whatever was happening in this room was happening on Marsh's timeline, and that the normal rhythms of the base were being asked to accommodate it. Marsh was 68 years old and carried his age the way certain buildings carried theirs, with the authority of things that had been tested repeatedly and had remained standing. Silver hair, close cut, blue eyes that processed information with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had spent a career learning that the most important thing in any room was usually not the most obvious thing. The recording protocols were established, classification confirmed at the highest available level. Marsh led the questioning with focused precision, guiding Voss through a detailed recounting of the operation, positions, distances, environmental conditions, equipment performance, target identification, engagement parameters, extraction complications. She used the language of operational reporting, precise about facts while remaining strategically vague about methods that did not need to exist in any document that might someday be read by the wrong person. After 40 minutes, Marsh looked at the intelligence officers. "I'll need a few minutes with Sergeant Voss and Commander Harlow. Classification remains at current level." The officers departed, the doors sealed behind them. Marsh looked at Voss. "Off the formal record," he said, "what you accomplished this morning is not something I have adequate words to describe in the context of operational achievement, so I won't try." He opened the folder in front of him. "What I will tell you is what happens now and why, and I'll tell you directly because you have earned directness." He turned the folder so she could read the top page. The official engagement distance was listed as 1,800 meters. The actual distance will be classified above standard operational documentation, Marsh said. It will not appear in any record accessible to standard intelligence review. Officially documenting a successful combat engagement at 3,000 plus meters under these conditions would require a comprehensive review of doctrine, equipment specifications, and training standards across multiple agencies. That review would take years. It would generate attention that this program cannot currently afford, and it would make certain aspects of your operational profile visible to people who do not need to know about them. Harlow had said nothing since the officers left. He was watching Marsh with the attention of a man filing everything he heard for later consideration. "I understand, sir," Voss said. "I want to be certain you do. This is not erasure. The record exists at the appropriate level. The people who need to know do know. What happened this morning will inform capability assessments and program development in ways that will not carry your name, but will carry your work." Marsh looked at her steadily. "Your achievement will not go unrecognized. It will simply be recognized through channels invisible to most of the world." He turned to a second page in the folder. "There is something else." Harlow straightened slightly. "Anton Dreykov did not come to Afghanistan to run a qualification exercise," Marsh said. "This morning's operation has confirmed what we assessed for months." He looked at Voss. "The 3 scouts who were killed were not killed as part of a training exercise. They were killed as a provocation, a calculated signal designed to produce a specific response from American command, specifically the deployment of the most capable, long-range precision asset available in this theater. Dreykov set a trap. He baited it with 3 American lives and waited to see what we would send." "And we sent me," Voss said. "And you sent him." The correction was precise. "Which means he knows that you exist, that you are operational, and that you are at a level of capability he has been searching for across multiple programs and multiple years." Marsh closed the folder. "The Phantom program is not primarily a sniper training operation. It is a talent identification and acquisition program. Dreykov has spent 15 years systematically identifying individuals who demonstrate what his research framework calls extreme perceptual integration in ballistic applications. He trains some of them, he recruits others, and the ones he cannot recruit, he let the implication stand. He eliminates, Harlow said. He eliminates, Marsh confirmed. Your father's research, Sergeant, was the theoretical foundation for everything Dreykov built. He obtained it through channels we became aware of only after the fact, and he has spent the better part of 2 decades applying it in directions your father specifically designed it not to go. The room held this for a long moment. The Kazakhstan facility, Voss said. Marsh looked at her with the careful attention of someone confirming a hypothesis. The Kazakhstan facility is the technical and operational center of the Phantom program. Dreykov's injury this morning, and I want to be clear that he survived and that we have confirmed his extraction, means the program's leadership structure is temporarily disrupted. This is the best operational window we have had in years. He looked at Harlow, then back to Voss. Master Sergeant Decker was the original operational lead for the Kazakhstan assessment. His injury changes that. His recommendation, which he transmitted from the medical facility at 11:30 this morning, is that you assume operational lead. Voss said nothing. The mission is assessment and intelligence gathering, with authority to neutralize the facility's operational capability if conditions warrant. A specialized team is already positioning in the region. They will need leadership that understands both what the facility is doing and what the people doing it are actually capable of. He paused. You are the only person currently available who has both. 72 hours for preparation, Marsh continued. Mission briefing at 0800 the day after tomorrow. He closed the folder. Questions? Voss had one question. Not among the operational questions her mind was generating. A simpler one. Does the facility have asset cobalt? The silence that followed was brief but complete. Marsh looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, something between confirmation and careful management of how much confirmation to provide. Where did you hear that designation? I haven't yet, she said, but I will. Tonight, at Bagram. Marsh held her gaze for a moment longer than simple information exchange required. Then, Asset Cobalt is a priority intelligence objective for the Kazakhstan operation. Confirm of status and, if alive, recovery is a primary mission parameter. He stood. The debrief was over. At the door he stopped, the way people stopped in this world when they had one more thing to say and had decided to say it outside the formal framework of the session. Your father was one of the most remarkable people I encountered in 40 years of this work, he said. Not because of what he could do, because he understood what it was for. That distinction is rarer than the capability itself. He looked at her with the directness of a man delivering something he has carried for a long time. He would recognize what you've become. I think he would be at peace with it. He left. The storage facility at Bagram was quiet in the way of institutional buildings after hours. Not silent, but occupied by the ambient sounds of infrastructure rather than people. The hum of climate control. The distant movement of aircraft. The ordinary sounds of a large installation maintaining itself through the night. Voss found the locker with the number from the leather tag. She stood in front of it for a moment before she inserted the key. The lock turned smoothly. Inside, in a waterproof container sealed against the environmental extremes of long-term storage, she found 3 things. The first was a set of journals, 4 of them, bound in weathered brown leather, filled from cover to cover in her father's handwriting. The script was precise and small, the handwriting of a person who thought carefully before committing anything to the page. Mathematical notation appeared throughout, integrated with written analysis in a way that moved fluidly between the 2 languages. The second was a set of engineering drawings for a targeting system unlike anything in standard military inventory. The design integrated computational components with analog elements in a configuration that suggested a different theoretical framework from conventional systems. One that treated the human operator not as the input device for a computational process, but as the computational process itself, with the technology serving as amplifier rather than replacement. The third was an envelope, Her name was written on it in handwriting she had not seen in 20 years and had never forgotten. The letters were formed with the same precision as everything else her father had written. Careful, considered, shaped by someone for whom clarity was a form of respect for the reader. She sat down on the floor of the storage facility with her back against the wall of lockers and opened the envelope. There were 4 pages inside, written by hand on plain paper, and she read them the way she had been taught to read terrain, completely, without rushing, letting the full picture form before drawing conclusions. My dearest Claire, if you are reading this, then the moment I anticipated has arrived, and Owen has decided, correctly I trust, that you are ready to receive it. I want to begin with what this is not. It is not a revelation. It is not a burden being transferred to you without your consent. It is, as accurately as I can describe it, an explanation of something you already know, the way we know things that exist below the surface of conscious understanding. The way you know that a room has changed before you identify what changed, or that a person is about to speak before they draw a breath. What certain people in certain institutions have chosen to call the sight is neither mysticism nor gift in any supernatural sense. It is a neurological architecture, a configuration of perceptual and integrative processing that handles certain categories of complex, dynamic, multivariable information differently from the standard human baseline. Your mother had elements of it in the way she read people. I had it in the domain of physical systems. In you, it manifests in the domain of ballistic dynamics, the ability to perceive and integrate the variables that govern a projectile's path through the physical world with a simultaneity and precision that exceeds what conscious calculation can achieve in the time available. This is not magic. It is physics. The physics of neural integration applied to the physics of motion through atmosphere. The fact that we do not yet have a complete scientific framework for describing it does not make it less real. There are many things we experience before we can explain them. I have spent years documenting cases, a small number because the trait is rare, in the journals you will find with this letter. My intention was always scientific rather than operational. I wanted to understand what this was, how it worked, what it meant for the people who carried it. I did not want it to become a weapons program or an acquisition target or a category of human capability that institutions would fight over the way they fight over everything they believe gives them an advantage. I was not entirely successful. Anton Drekhov obtained portions of my research through a source I did not identify until it was too late to contain the exposure. What he built from it is a different thing from what I intended, oriented toward exploitation rather than understanding. I am sorry for that. It is the regret I carry most heavily. What you need to understand about yourself is this. The ability you have is not a tool separate from you that you can pick up and set down. It is structural. It is part of how you process the physical world. Training has refined it and given it precision, but Owen did not create it and I did not give it to you. You were born with it, and it has been yours since before you could have understood what it was. The targeting system in this container is something I designed specifically for operators with this architecture. It does not replace the perceptual integration. Nothing replaces it, because nothing else can do what it does. What it does is amplify the precision of the output. It translates what you perceive into a mechanical interface that accounts for the variables you are already processing in ways that standard targeting systems cannot accommodate. You will understand how to use it immediately. I designed it so that you would. What I can tell you is that the ability carries with it a responsibility that I believe you already understand. The people who cannot see what you can see deserve protection from those who would use vision like yours as a weapon against them. Your whole life, you have been the person who arrives after something has gone wrong and makes it right. That is not a role I assigned you. It is what you chose from the beginning, before you had language for what you were choosing. I saw it in you when you were 8 years old and understood then what you would become. And I have been proud of that understanding every day since, Through all the years I could not tell you I was watching. The compass I gave you the morning I left was my father's. He carried it through Korea. He told me that it didn't point to magnetic north. It pointed to wherever home was, and that the two things were usually the same but not always, and that when they weren't, you followed the compass rather than the map. Find what the compass points to, Claire. That is the only navigation instruction you need. I love you. I have always loved you. Across whatever distance has existed between us, that has not changed and cannot change, because some things are not subject to the physics of separation. Your father. She sat with the letter for a long time. The storage facility held its ambient sounds around her. The infrastructure of a large military installation maintaining itself through the night, indifferent to what was happening in the small human moment against the wall of lockers. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that grief in her was not something that moved through tears, but through stillness, a quality of being entirely present with something that could not be changed, holding it without flinching, then carrying it forward rather than setting it down. She opened the first journal. Her father's handwriting moved across the pages in the precise, careful script she recognized, documenting cases with the methodical rigor of a scientist who trusted the process over the conclusion. The first entry was dated 1987. The most recent she found was 2002, the year before his last deployment. She read for 2 hours. What she found was not what she had expected, and it was exactly what she should have expected. Not a record of extraordinary capabilities described in extraordinary terms, but ordinary scientific observation. Careful, skeptical, thorough, willing to acknowledge uncertainty and the limits of the framework, building toward understanding rather than assertion. Her father had not been trying to prove something. He had been trying to understand something. The difference was evident in every page. The final journal entry, 3 weeks before his last deployment, contained a single paragraph that she read twice. I have come to believe that the most important characteristic of individuals with this architecture is not the capability itself, but the restraint that consistently accompanies it. In every case I have documented, the capacity for harm is accompanied by an equally developed, and perhaps causally related, orientation toward protection. The ability to see what will happen is paired with the refusal to cause it without sufficient reason. I do not fully understand the connection, but I believe it is structural rather than moral, that the same neural configuration that produces the perceptual integration also produces the quality of judgment that governs its use. If this is correct, then the individuals I have studied are not dangerous in the way that Dreykov's program treats them as dangerous. They are the opposite of dangerous. They are, in the most precise sense, safe. She closed the journal. Near the back of the fourth journal, tucked between the final pages, she found something she had not expected. A photograph, black and white. 2 men standing outside what appeared to be a university building. One was her father, younger than she had ever known him, in civilian clothes. The other was a man she didn't recognize, similar age, similar build, with the careful eyes of someone accustomed to solving problems that didn't have obvious solutions. On the back, in her father's handwriting, Marcus, the one who understood it first. If Dreykov has him, find him. He knows what I couldn't finish. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she placed it carefully in the envelope with the letter. Asset Cobalt had a face now. Decker's room at the Bagram Medical Facility was quiet when she arrived at 0700. He was awake, which she had expected. He had finished arguing with the doctors, which told her the pain medication had started working. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. He looked at her. She placed the letter on the blanket beside his hand. He looked at it. He did not look surprised. He did not look relieved or vindicated. He looked, simply, like a man who had arrived at a point he had been walking toward for 20 years and found it to be what he had expected it to be. You knew everything, she said. I knew what your father told me and what I observed myself over the years. There were things I suspected that I couldn't confirm. He looked at the letter. There are things in there I never read. He told me what I needed to know to fulfill the promise and asked me to let the rest be between you and him. Voss looked at him for a moment. At the face of a man who had spent more than 20 years honoring a promise made by a soldier who had known he was not coming back. At the economy of that commitment, not sentimental, not performed, but simply kept year after year because the person who had asked for it, and that had been sufficient reason. Asset Cobalt, she said, my father's research partner, the physicist who worked with him on the theoretical foundations. Decker was quiet for a long moment, long enough for her to understand that the question had landed somewhere significant. I don't know who Asset Cobalt is, he said finally. I know your father believed there was someone else, someone who had worked with him on the theoretical foundations and had subsequently gone into channels your father couldn't follow. He thought that person was in danger if Dreykov ever became aware of the research. He paused. He didn't tell me more than that, but I think you found something in the journals. A photograph, Voss said, and a name. Decker nodded slowly. He looked at the ceiling. Then you know what the Kazakhstan mission is actually for. I know what it's for. She reached into the chest pocket of her jacket and took out the brass compass. She held it for a moment, the weight of it familiar, the worn surface of it the most familiar physical object in her life. 20 years against her sternum, her father's instrument, a piece of equipment that had survived Korea and Somalia and 2 decades of classified operations and had somehow ended up here, in this room, at this moment. She placed it in Decker's hand. He looked down at it. Keep it until you're back on your feet, she said. Consider it collateral. He closed his fingers around it. He looked up at her with an expression that was the closest thing to open emotion she had seen on his face since she had known him, which was not very open at all, but was, for him, significant. Your father gave me that same look, he said, the morning he left for the last time. What look? The one that says you've already thought through every available outcome and made your peace with the ones you can't control. He paused. It's a good look to have. It's rare. Voss stood. I'll be back for the compass. I'll be walking by then. I know. She left him in the morning light of the medical facility and walked out into the controlled noise of Bagram Air Base, where the machinery of military operations moved around her with its organized purpose, and she moved through it with the attention of someone who has just received information that changes the framing of everything they have already experienced. Sloane was waiting outside. She had driven from FOB Sentinel on the same flight as Harlow, which told Voss something about the lieutenant's relationship with information. She always seemed to be where things were happening before anyone had told her things were happening. The Kazakhstan team package came through, Sloane said, falling into step beside her. I've already cross-referenced it against the meteorological data for the Karaganda region. The winter inversion layer creates significant density altitude variations between 0600 and 0900. You'll want to plan around that. She paused. I also put together terrain analysis for the 3 most likely facility locations, based on Dreykov's documented preference for natural concealment from aerial surveillance. Voss looked at her. You did that overnight. I started it when Marsh landed. I had a feeling the briefing wasn't going to be routine. Sloane handed her a folded document. For what it's worth, it was an honor to support this operation, Sergeant. Voss took the document. You did more than support it, Lieutenant. Sloane nodded once and turned back toward the base. Some acknowledgments didn't need more than that. Harlow found Voss at the airfield at 0930, standing at the edge of the ramp where the transport would arrive within the hour. He had driven from FOB Sentinel himself rather than sending a representative. She noted this before he spoke. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking, looking at the mountains to the northeast. Then he turned to face her with the directness of a man who had decided that the situation warranted setting aside the protective distance of command formality. I owe you an acknowledgement, he said. Sir, let me finish. He said it without harshness. When you arrived at FOB Sentinel, I had a set of assumptions. Some were professional and reasonable, given the information available to me. Some were something else. What happened over the last 72 hours has made clear to me that both categories were inadequate. He paused. I was wrong about what you were, not about whether you were competent. I could see that within the first 20 minutes. I was wrong about who you were, about what you were carrying and why. Voss looked at him steadily. Most people take longer to admit that, she said. Most people don't have the benefit of watching someone make history from across a mountain valley with a rifle they modified themselves, and then come back and argue with a doctor about whether to evacuate their wounded teammate. He allowed a small, careful expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. That clarifies certain things. They stood for a moment in the way that two people stand when something has been said that needed saying, and the atmosphere around it needs time to settle. The wind call, Harlow said, right before the shot. Decker's report says the instruments hadn't registered the shift yet, that you adjusted before the data was available. He looked at her carefully. How did you know? She thought about how to answer this, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the answer existed at the intersection of things she understood and things she was still understanding, and she wanted to give him something accurate rather than something simply satisfying. I didn't calculate it, she said. I listened. There's a quality that the air has before it shifts, a texture almost, a change in the pressure against your skin and the sound it makes moving past your ears. She paused. My father called it listening to the air. He told me once that the wind knows where it's going before it gets there, and that if you're quiet enough, you can hear it thinking. She looked at the mountains. I don't know if that's the right description. It's the one he gave me. Harlow nodded slowly. He absorbed it the way he had absorbed everything about her over the last 3 days. Not skeptically, not with the need to categorize it immediately, but with the patient consideration of a man who has learned that some things require time to understand. Get back, he said. It was not a command in the operational sense. It was something else. The thing commanding officers said to the people they were sending into danger when they had no power over the danger and only one thing left to offer. Yes, sir. She picked up her kit bag and walked toward the aircraft. The transport was on final approach, the sound of its engines rising over the controlled noise of the airfield. Around her, the machinery of the base moved with its ordinary purpose: fuel trucks, ground crews, the constant logistical circulation of a facility that never fully stopped. In her chest pocket, where the compass had rested for 20 years, there was now only the letter. The compass was in Decker's hand, in a recovery ward 200 meters behind her. She would come back for it. But the compass had never been about the object. Her father had understood that when he pressed it into her hand at 12 years old, on a morning he had known might be the last morning of the life they had shared. The compass pointed to wherever home was. Home was not a place, it was a direction. The thing you moved toward when the map ran out, and the only navigation left was the one you carried inside you. She had found it. She was walking toward it now. The aircraft ramp lowered. She crossed the tarmac and went up it without looking back, and the cold air of Bagram fell away behind her as the hold closed and the engines rose to their operational pitch. In her kit bag was the letter. In the inside pocket of her jacket was the photograph. Two young men outside a university building, one of them her father, one of them a man named Marcus who had understood something important and had subsequently gone somewhere no one official had been able to follow. Asset Cobalt. Somewhere in the winter landscape of northern Kazakhstan, in a facility that the Phantom program had spent years building into the operational center of Anton Dreykov's life's work, a man was either alive or not. He either knew what her father had spent 2 decades trying to finish understanding, or that knowledge had died with him. She intended to find out. The aircraft leveled off above the mountains. Below, Afghanistan receded into the geometric abstraction of high-altitude observation. Ridges and valleys reduced to shapes and shadows. The violence and history of the ground made abstract by distance. But the shot was real. 3,247 meters, 6 seconds. The longest confirmed shot in the history of precision marksmanship, confirmed in a single classified document that would be read by fewer than 12 people and would never appear in any record available to the public, to the press, to the historians who would eventually write about this period of American military operations in this part of the world. Her name would not be in those histories, but the work would be in them, in the ways that matter, in the lives that continued because a threat had been stopped, in the program that had been disrupted, in the knowledge that whatever came next would be met by someone who understood what was possible in ways that the enemy had not anticipated. That was the nature of the work her father had described. Not recognition, not record. The thing itself, done correctly, for reasons that held up when examined honestly. She settled back in her seat as the aircraft climbed north. The compass would be there when she returned. Decker would be walking by then. She had told him so, and she had meant it, and she was not in the habit of saying things she didn't mean. And somewhere ahead, in the cold, institutional architecture of a facility built to exploit the rarest form of human perception, a man named Marcus was waiting to be found, or waiting to be confirmed as lost. Either answer mattered. Both answers were part of what her father had left behind. In the journals, in the letters, in the careful scientific documentation of a mind that had refused to treat extraordinary human capability as anything other than what it was. Physics, not yet named, not yet fully understood, but real. As real as the wind she had felt before the instruments moved. As real as 6 seconds of silence over the valley floor of Kunar province. As real as the shot that had just changed the calculus of precision warfare in ways that would ripple through specialized communities for years. Quietly, without attribution, the way the most important changes always moved. She closed her eyes. The aircraft carried her north into the winter, and the mountains fell away behind her, and the work continued.